Michelle, you got rid of Pablo. I take back every bad thing I ever said about you. Hello everyone, I'm Dan the Man. Well, once again, I was not able to get a new video up before the nominations, so I think we'll just say for the rest of the season, I'll be doing the new videos after the nominations. So with that out of the way, on to my review. Nicole, after 2 seasons of never winning anything, stepped up and won both the head of household and the power of veto. She also had the tiebreaker vote, so this was definitely Nicole's week. Not surprisingly, the veto was not used, as Nicole had her target on the block. She and Corey did briefly mention the possibility of using the veto to put up Victor and break the power pairing of Paul and Victor, but it was not really discussed long even on the feeds. Nicole, Corey, Paul, and Victor are all in, and the only way the veto was ever getting used was if Michelle or Paul won it, which they didn't. I picked on James a lot last video, and I don't dislike the guy, I just think he's bad at Big Brother, as he's shown. Twice now. So I'm trying to be easier on him, but I gotta say he, along with Natalie and Michelle, were naive not to be more suspicious of Nicole and Corey. Michelle was worried, and Natalie and James did bring it up, but Michelle should have not listened to them and tried harder to campaign. Doubt it would have worked, but she didn't even try until just before they went live, and it was made clear to her she was going home, and by then it was definitely too late. It wasn't just that Nicole and Corey were talking little game to James and Natalie, and Paul and Victor spent so much time with Nicole and Corey this week, but Victor and Paul are fighters, and have been all season. If Paul really thought he was a target, he and Victor would have been working overtime to try and make something happen with James and Natalie. It was out of character for them to not try and just throw their hands in the air and give up, so that, along with a lot of other things, should have been a heads up. The fact not only did they barely even acknowledge it, but James was so confident he actually offered to throw the head of household was ridiculous. James, right before last week's eviction, told Nicole and Corey he was voting for Corey, which I went over in depth last video. But once you tell a longtime ally just before going live you're going to vote against their wishes, you damn well don't change your mind again. Then Nicole, instead of putting up both members of the power pairing everyone had wanted out, puts one up next to someone she'd been enemies with before, who she knows will gun for her, when she and her showmance have the deciding vote, and James thinks Nicole will just keep someone who it doesn't benefit her to keep in, just to stay loyal to a guy who is going to stab her in the back. It baffles my mind he ever thought Michelle was safe. James was either real cocky or real oblivious. I don't even know which one, but he got a wake-up call. He has no one but himself to blame for losing an ally in Michelle and being on the outs. He stepped down and handed the power to Nicole right after giving her no reason to trust him. Then he does nothing when she puts an ally of his up that serves no purpose for Nicole to keep around. Then the fact 4 people he stabbed in the back last week are constantly hanging out, and he still doesn't see the writing on the wall. James messed up. And while most would say his big mistake was stepping down in the endurance, I think his big mistake was earlier. Where he messed up was by telling Nicole and Corey that he was voting out Corey and then not doing it. It's in my opinion why Nicole went to Victor and Paul. Had he voted Corey out, Paul and Victor might not have been as quick to go to Nicole if it was just her by herself, even if she did still put up Michelle. And if he hadn't told Nicole and Corey was going to do that, they never would have known he was about to turn on them. Nicole and James clearly have a history through the Big Brother "we were all on the same show, so now we are embedded in each other's life forever" circle that most of these people seem to fall into. And she has shown to be loyal to him the entire time. If he hadn't given her a reason not to trust him, I think it would have been Paul or Victor that went home this week. That decision was likely where he lost the game. It was just a matter of when he went home at that point, not if. Before getting into the eviction, I want to take a second to talk about Corey using the bribe. Some would argue that giving it to Victor was a waste since he was going to vote out Michelle anyway, and that the better option would have been to give it to James or Natalie to throw the HOH comp and hedge his bets next head of household. Especially since James was stupid enough to offer. Yeah, once the vote came out, James or Nat would have realized they screwed up taking the bribe, but the rules were once they agreed to do it, they had to honor it, so they still would have had to throw the HOH competition. But what people don't see is that while it did nothing to change what was going to happen, it solidified the Final Four deal. Victor was genuinely touched that Corey did that, and both Paul and Victor recognized he basically handed one of them a gift, and thus they trusted Corey and Nicole more than ever. It should also be noted, James offering to throw the head of household for the bribe was in fact dicey, even if he was possibly joking. Corey and Nicole can't see what we see. They didn't see all the talks between Victor and Paul that pretty much made it clear those two were all in with Nicole and Corey, and were not even entertaining not going forward together. For all Corey knew, Victor was working something on the side they didn't know about. Paul is a threat to win, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that Victor would have decided to turn on him. It would not be the biggest betrayal in Big Brother history by a long shot. And with that, on to the eviction. Was Michelle the right choice? Well, obviously not for Natalie and James, but they didn't vote to evict her, so they knew that. Was it right for the three who voted out Michelle? Well, for Victor, obviously. His number one ally versus someone who has done nothing for him but vote him out last week. Obviously not a hard decision for him what he should do. But was it the right decision for Nicole and Corey? Well, that's dicey. Most seem to think she's an idiot not to get out Paul or Victor. Time will tell if keeping them around was the losing decision, but I've said plenty of times by now, Nicole and Corey had no reason to trust James and Natalie. None. Also, Michelle was gunning for them, especially Nicole. Victor wasn't, and Victor and Paul are definitely sincere in wanting to go to the end with Nicole and Corey. So at the end of the day, they had no reason to trust James and Natalie to take them to the end. So why keep someone who is only beneficial to James and Natalie around over someone who sincerely plans to work with them? So all in all, I think they made the right call, especially Michelle. It could be argued while James and Natalie might have turned on them. If they didn't, Nicole and Corey had a better chance at winning going to the Final Four with Natalie and James. And I often preach that playing to go far is not better than playing to win. But even with that, it's not likely they are not given a chance to go further. Yes, in a Final Four scenario, Paul and Victor, especially Victor, are bigger threats to win the Final Four head of household over Natalie and James. But Victor and Paul are not unbeatable. Michelle won 2 comps last week that Victor and Paul both competed in, and Corey has won 3 comps where at least one of those guys was also in the competition. So it's not a given they can't beat them by any means. So I think they made the best decision given what their options were. Corey, Nicole, Victor, and Paul are likely going to make the Final Four, so now if Corey or Nicole win the Final Four power of veto, at least one of them will get to the Final 2. Not a popular decision, and not the one that seems obvious, but the obvious decision that the fans want to see is not always the best one for someone's game. So for the final bit of business, the head of household. Victor won once again, and it was a critical win because Natalie and James would have likely put Victor and Paul on the block. The nominations were pretty cut and dry. It was clear from the minute Victor won that Natalie and James were going on the block. The only way they were going up on the block was if one of them won head of household. Natalie gave it a good try, but came up short on the head of household competition the time she needed it the most all game. I was surprised the editors didn't try harder to build some suspense. I saw James trying to get Victor to put up Corey or Nicole next to him, and figured they played them considering it up a little more to give the illusion of suspense. But like when it happened live, neither really cared about the previous Final Four deal, and it missed James' attempts. And James and Natalie went up to the shock of absolutely no one. So who will go home? Well, the target's James at the moment, but Nicole and Corey will pretty much decide the vote. While I don't think they'll blindside Paul and Victor at this point and go against their wishes, the reality is that James would likely not put up Nicole or Corey if he won head of household. Natalie would. So given the way Big Brother players overthink their initial plans, the tide could very well turn and Natalie could end up going home. The veto will only be a factor of James if Natalie win it, but all that does is seal the other's fate. Not sure how serious they were about using it on each other if they win, although both did say they would. But if one of them wins the veto and takes themselves down, or had an idiot moment and takes the other person down, all it's going to do is seal whoever stays up on the block's fate. Obviously Victor would then put up Nicole or Corey. I think it would be Nicole, just because she's never gone up, so it would be argued it's time for her to take one for the team. But either way, they would not go home. The real interesting thing will be next week. Well, not likely. James or Natalie, whichever stays, could possibly win the head of household, which obviously would change things. And even if they don't, whichever is left might be appealing to take as a Final 3 ally, rather than go to a Final 4 as 2 pairs and hope for the best. I think it's the most likely scenario if James stays. Even after all he did to hurt Nicole and Corey's trust, Nicole's friends with James outside the house, and in Big Brother, that can be huge. But for the most part, I don't think any of the Final Four alliance will turn on each other, so long as one of them wins the next head of household. And likely whoever doesn't go this week will go next week, barring a veto win. Thanks for watching. I'm Dan the Man, and I'll see you next time. But before I go, I wanted to address that there's actually a petition on change.org to bring Pablo back to Victor. Sometimes I'm ashamed to be a Big Brother fan. Although I will admit, this one's funny.